Topical questions. The next item of business is a debate on motion 1223 in the name of Michael Russell on the European Union Withdrawal Bill UK legislation. Could I ask any member who wishes to speak in this debate to press their request to speak buttons now? And I call on Michael Russell to speak to and move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, when Donald Dewar spoke at the opening of the Scottish Parliament, the reopening, as he himself acknowledged, on the 1st of July 1999, he talked of it being a new stage on a journey begun long ago and which has no end. Presiding Officer, you were there to hear that speech. So was I. So were the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister sitting on this front bench today. So were Tavish Scott and Mike Rumbles. So was Ian Gray and Elaine Smith. 26 members of this present Parliament were, so to speak, in at the beginning. Though the beginning was actually a culmination of a long campaign and struggle, which was fought, again in Donald Dewar's words, to achieve the day when democracy was renewed in Scotland. Of course, I and all the others on these benches disagreed then with Donald Dewar about the final destination of that journey, just as we disagree on that matter with others here today. Yet that was not the important thing on that opening day, and it's not the important thing today. The important thing was, and is, to acknowledge the progress that had and has been made. To accept that on this journey together in a Parliament of minorities, a journey the Scottish people told us to take, and which they voted for by an overwhelming majority, we should find a way to secure tangible gains for our country, no matter our vision of where we wanted to end up. That's our duty, because this Scottish Parliament belongs to the people of Scotland, not to us as parliamentarians, nor to this government or any government. As elected members, we hold this place and our powers in trust for the generations that voted for them, for this generation, and for the generations to come. They decide on journey and endpoint, not us. Presiding Officer, over the past 19 years, this Scottish Parliament has, in the greatest part, been good for Scotland. The powers of the Scottish Parliament have been used by administrations of different political complexions to improve the lives of many, hopefully most, of the people living in Scotland, often in response to some of the most serious challenges they face. Every one of us in this chamber has played a part in that, from securing free personal care for the elderly to abolishing tuition fees, from establishing world-leading climate change legislation to delivering equal marriage, from putting in place the UK's first smoking ban to agreeing that for the health of our nation, we should introduce minimum unit pricing for alcohol, from eliminating business rates on small enterprises to supporting innovative and profitable renewable energy generation. We have and we use these powers because we enjoy an established system of government called devolution. It may not be able to secure everything all of us want, but devolution, put in place in 1999 and strengthened by subsequent agreement with Westminster, has made our system of governance robust enough to withstand expected and unexpected challenge and difficulty, robust enough to withstand a global financial crash and to resist, at least in part, the misguided and damaging policy of austerity. Now it's our job to ensure that it is not cast aside because of a Brexit which Scotland did not vote for and which can only be damaging to our country. Today, the challenge of Brexit, or rather the challenge of the proposed power grab by the UK Tory government under the guise of delivering Brexit, puts our devolved settlement at risk. The Secretary of State for Scotland, who incidentally also heard Donald Dewar's opening remarks as a member of this Parliament, dismissively described the issues we are debating today as dancing on the head of a pin. Presiding Officer, it's not dancing on the head of a pin to insist that 20 years of stable devolution that has delivered good things for our fellow citizens be protected. Of course.
Pauline McNeill.
Thank you for giving me. I was one of the 26, I think. As one of the 26 that you talked about in the first Parliament, I wonder if you would agree that Donald Dewar was the champion of devolution and prior to that ensuring that the model, unlike the Welsh model, the Scottish model, was very much designed that it would be those powers which were reserved was quite a deliberate act. And any attempt to change that is definitely undermining what we all and Donald Dewar chose to try and achieve in those days.
I would agree with that. It is a good point, and the reserve model of devolution, which is not precisely the same as the Welsh model, is one that requires us to defend that and to consent when there are changes. And I shall come on to that point. Now, it's not dancing, as I said, on the head of a pin, Presiding Officer, to insist that 20 years of stable devolution that's delivered good things for our fellow citizens be protected, nor to demand the powers we use for the benefit of Scotland, which have been agreed by the people of Scotland. Now, in one view, the vulnerability of the principles of devolution to the UK government's approach to Brexit shouldn't surprise us. That government cannot answer even the most basic of questions on issues such as the customs union, with just months to go before a withdrawal agreement must be signed. It has dismissed this Parliament's views on wider Brexit issues, such as the single market and the triggering of Article 50. It's acted recklessly towards prosperity and peace in Northern Ireland. The reality of the last 23 months is that Theresa May seems concerned only about trying to keep together the warring factions of her party, regardless of the impact on jobs, living standards or devolution. Presiding Officer, in contrast to the division at Westminster, there has been consensus in this chamber over the need to protect the Scottish Parliament's powers. The Scottish Government has always acknowledged we must prepare our laws for withdrawal. In line with the clear majority of people in Scotland, we don't want to leave the EU, but we accept that legal preparation for Brexit is required. And the UK Government, for its part, recognised that it is required to get our consent to their EU withdrawal bill. And on that point, this Parliament spoke very powerfully when, in the interim report of the Finance and Constitution Committee in January, they agreed unanimously that the bill was incompatible with the devolution settlement in Scotland, and it could not therefore recommend consent. And Clause 11 of the bill is... not at this moment, please. I want to make some progress. Clause 11 was not an accidental clause. It encapsulates the current UK Government's view of the type of devolution it wants to see operating only by the grace and favour of Downing Street. Now, to be fair, the UK Government eventually responded to the unanimous view of this Parliament and the Welsh Assembly and many others by making changes. But it is still clear in its newly reformulated Clause 11 how the UK Government sees power being exercised on withdrawal from the EU. It's still clear how they view this Parliament, and that view is unacceptable. For it would abandon the way in which we have all operated for almost 2 decades and break the devolution settlement we have.
Adam Tompkins.
For giving way. Would the Minister explain why, contrary to his view, the view of the United Kingdom Government is acceptable to the Labour Government in Wales?
Well, I think that probably is a question for the Labour government in Wales, but I would hazard a guess that one of the factors is that Scotland voted to remain in the EU and Wales voted to leave, something perhaps Tory members might want to reflect on. The UK government wants to take a power to restrict the competence of this Parliament. It wants to be able to exercise that power even in the face of an explicit decision from this Parliament that it should not do so. This isn't about the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament or giving effect to the Sewell Convention. This is about the UK Government, not the UK Parliament, for the first time being able to adjust the terms on which devolution operates through delegated legislation, and to be able to do so without the consent or actually against the wishes of this Parliament. There are existing and effective powers under the original Scotland Act which allow the competence of this Parliament or the Scottish Government to be adjusted. None of them operate in the way set out in the UK Government's new Clause 11. Every single one of them requires changes to be passed by both the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament. Every single one of them requires proper democratic consent to be sought and received. Real consent, not presumed consent. A Section 30 order, for example, adjusting the list of reserved matters and therefore the boundaries of devolution, requires to be passed by this Parliament. It cannot become law without the consent of the Parliament and the country it affects. And there have been 30 orders passed under Section 30 since the Parliament was established, all the product of agreement, all passed in this place and at Westminster. Even the Section 30 order for an independence referendum was able to secure support and win the consent of both parliaments. Now, the UK Government says it would not normally make these regulations without our consent. But those are not words that appear in the legislation. The legislation is actually drafted on the basis that proceeding with an order, even without consent from this Parliament, even if this Parliament has unanimously voted against it, will be normal. And it is that legislation to which we are being asked to consent. Moreover, the actual amendments to Clause 11, now passed by the House of Lords, say that the powers of this Parliament can be constrained for up to 7 years, whether the Parliament agrees, whether it does not agree, or whether it makes no decision at all. The purpose... Just one moment.
Sure, Stevenson.
Is the Minister aware it may even for fishing be worse than that, in that the leaked white paper last week suggested that beyond the 7 years, the powers over fishing would be retained at Westminster? That is bitterly disappointing to fishermen in my constituency across Scotland. Is that how the government feels too?
Minister. It is indeed. And of course he is right. It is possible with primary legislation within that period to permanently remove powers. The purpose of the constraint is apparently to enable discussion to take place on the establishment of common UK frameworks, but there's no need to impose an unprecedented, unequal and unacceptable new legislative constraint. We've already agreed there may be the need in certain areas to establish such frameworks. And in keeping with the spirit and principle of devolution, we agree those frameworks should be the product of negotiation and agreement between governments and parliaments. We agree that pending the establishment of common frameworks, both governments should maintain existing EU law regimes across the UK. Now, the Secretary of State for Scotland has said frameworks shouldn't be imposed. But as the Finance and Constitution Committee reported, this commitment that common frameworks will not be imposed is contradicted by the consent decision mechanism created by the UK Government's amendments, which would allow the UK Government to proceed with regulations without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. The committee made the key point that the devolution settlement can only function effectively if there is mutual trust between all of the UK's governments, if the substantial political agreement between governments is given effect by political means. The answer, Presiding Officer, therefore, is to proceed through reciprocal political commitments. That was the view of all parties on the committee except the Conservatives. And today in this motion, the Scottish Government is asking Parliament to withhold consent to the bill as it stands. Now, this won't be the end of the process. The offer of this Parliament is still on the table. However, passing this motion means that the EU withdrawal bill must be adjusted, either so it can command the consent of this Parliament or to reflect the terms of the legislative consent motion. And if the motion is passed today, that will be the will of this Parliament. What cannot happen, Presiding Officer, is what the UK Government seems to want to happen. No, I'm sorry, I want to conclude. They want to ignore the reality of devolution. They want to drown out what this Parliament says. But not even they can pretend that no motion has been passed. Nor can they pretend that this Parliament is failing to face up to its responsibilities to enable the statute book for which it is responsible to be prepared. We are doing that, have done it through the Continuity Bill, and are doing it through this process today. The actions of the UK Government, were they to impose legislation on this Parliament, would be serious and unprecedented, and they would be noted here and across Europe. If there is a failure after today's vote to adapt the bill to devolution, it will be the UK that would be breaking trust and breaking the rules, not us. Presiding Officer, Donald Dewar began his famous speech in 1999 by looking at the mace that was in front of him then and is in front of us now. It has inscribed on it the first words of our founding statute, "There shall be a Scottish Parliament." 20 years ago, they were words of aspiration, a statement of constitutional intent. Now they are words of constitutional reality and of resolve. There is a Scottish Parliament, and its voice must be heard. Donald Dewar cautioned us in his speech that the Scottish Parliament was not an end, it was a means to greater ends. And today we are called on for the first time to protect those means by refusing to accept changes to them to which we have not agreed. To protect those means so that we can go on achieving the best ends for Scotland we can. To protect those means because the people of Scotland themselves chose them, and they chose us to protect them. And accordingly, Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name.